Hey guys, it's Danny. So the question today is, do we really need to flush out our orchid pots to remove salt buildups? Well, to give you the short answer, it doesn't hurt. But to give you the long answer, it really depends, and sometimes it's really not as bad as we might think, and I'll tell you why. Now, the accumulation of salts in our orchid pots depends on a million of factors, I've started to believe. And recently, in my search of what manages to burn my orchid roots, I discovered some pretty interesting things. Okay, so in case you weren't aware of this technique, flushing of pots with plain water, not fertilized water, is used in the intention of clearing some of the salt accumulations in the medium on the roots and so on. Basically, it should prevent burnt roots from our orchids. Fertilizing can cause some salt buildups in our orchid pots. How much salt buildup? Well, this really depends on a lot of factors. So first, let's take the potting medium you're using. Some materials like sphagnum moss tend to retain more salts than materials like bark. However, I'm not sure if I can say the porosity of one material affects it, because my ceramics doesn't really hold too many salts, because I did do some tests and it appears that my pots have almost no salt accumulations at all. However, Brad here on YouTube flushed out a Paphiopedilum pot which was composed of bark and sphagnum moss and found quite a lot of salt accumulation. So the type of medium you're using can affect the buildup you will find in your pot. Another factor that will determine how much salt buildup you'll have is the type of orchid you're growing, starting with its maturity, the species you have, how much fertilizer you are dosing to your orchid, and the state of health of your orchid. So let's take them one by one and discuss a little bit. So the type of orchid you are having will influence the accumulation of salts in what way? Some orchids are heavy feeders because they have a fast growth, such as the Catasetum here, which grows an entire pseudobulb within about 9 months. However, some orchids are not heavy feeders and they grow very slow, like Paphiopedilums here. So there is a chance Paphiopedilums will not consume as many nutrients as a fast grower. Thus, accumulation in the orchid pot will be greater in a Paphiopedilum pot, let's say. Likewise, a seedling orchid might not consume as many nutrients as a fully mature orchid because it simply does not have as many structures to feed and to maintain. So in a seedling pot, there might be a greater chance to have salt accumulations than in a mature orchid's pot. The quantity of roots will also affect this, because the more roots an orchid has, the more nutrients it will absorb. So an orchid that suffers from a lack of roots might not consume as many nutrients as one that has an extensive root system. Thus, the salt buildup will be greater in the pot with the orchid that doesn't have too many roots. Now, leaving aside the type of orchid you have, its maturity, its habit, its pattern of growth, there are even more factors at play here. And one of them is the type of fertilizer you are using. Some fertilizers are created to be used at every watering, such as the rain mix, the MSU formula, and some others. And using these fertilizers might mean you are dosing a lower quantity than a different type of fertilizer which is intended to be used every month, let's say. Exactly how this will affect the salt buildup is really unsure, because you need to test the quantity you are dosing at one time. For example, the recommended dosage of rain mix is around 200 parts per million at each watering. Other fertilizers might have a different quantity. It might be lower or it might be higher. Another factor that will influence the salt buildup is your fertilizing regime. Some people like to fertilize with a low quantity at every watering, while others like to split the recommended dosage in two, and in between just use plain water. So let's take the last instance and see what happens. Whenever we fertilize, there is a chance that some salts are left behind. They are not consumed by the orchid. However, if we use plain water in between waterings, we manage to dissolve the salts and make them available for the orchids once again. Let's go back a little bit to the orchids. Depending on the season, orchids grow slower or faster. Usually in the summertime, the day length is bigger and also there are warmer temperatures, so orchids grow faster than they would grow in wintertime. At this point, they will pick up more fertilizer than they do in wintertime. So there is a chance that in wintertime we'll have more accumulations than in summertime or in the warmer months. And to add a final idea, which doesn't necessarily apply to many people, it depends on how you water your orchids. For example, I water them in a very specific way that I don't think many people do. So what I do is I pour water through the pot and I let it accumulate in the tray, and then I do not dump out the tray. Now, some might say it's a sure recipe for accumulating salts. However, I tested the water coming from my pots and it's really not that full of salts. Indeed, I had some salts accumulated, but the difference between my osmosis water and the water resulted from the pot was around 20 parts per million, which is very negligible, and in no way it can burn roots or create problems. How do I explain this? Well, there is a really simple answer. From time to time, I do wash and clean out the dishes under my orchids, and what I suspect is happening is that whatever salt does not get picked up by my orchids sediments on the bottom. I wash it and problem is pretty much over. However, there is also the chance that my orchids are simply using up the fertilizer I'm using. As I was saying, I have used the rain mix, which recommends fertilizing at every watering, and I don't use the full dosage, I use half of the dosage. Lately, I've also started to use plain osmosis water, so I'm guessing that whatever salt was in my pot got diluted and got reused by the orchids. So in my case, even after 3 months of watering the way I do not have salt accumulation, none that I can measure in any way. And if you know the saga about the rain mix, I kind of discovered the culprit and I stopped using the rain mix. I'm gonna use a different type of fertilizer. However, I don't expect me to have any sorts of trouble with salt accumulations. And to be extra sure, I will kind of flush out my pots in the sense that I will use osmosis water, let the water accumulate in the tray, and afterwards maybe I'm gonna dump the water in the tray rather than let it sediment on the bottom or be reabsorbed by the pot. And pretty much me and salt accumulations are not gonna be an issue. So the problem of flushing your pots might be a little variable. It depends on many things, and it might be different from one setup to another. So the best thing to do if you're concerned about this is to buy a TDS meter. You can find cheap ones on eBay or Amazon. You don't have to spend a fortune. They're not the most exact things you've ever seen, but they will give you an idea if you have any type of accumulation. So see if your environment and in your setup you have accumulation of salts, because if you don't, maybe you don't really need to hassle with flashing your pots every 1 week, 2 weeks, or whatever. So alrighty, thank you for watching this video, and thank you Fifi for having this discussion with me and giving me the idea for this video. Hope this was useful for you, and if you'd like to see more orchid videos from me, simply subscribe to my channel. I post on a daily basis. Feel free to always leave me comments down below if you have questions or suggestions for videos from me. I always read my comments, and always feel free to send me a letter at the address you see on the screen or in the description below. Choose an option on the screen if you'd like to visit my website orchidnature.com or watch another orchid video. Don't forget to rate and subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!